Okay, welcome everyone. We are continuing with 70 Faces, and tonight we're going to do 2 chapters. And with this, we will finish the first section of the book on letters. So the 2 chapters tonight, for those who are following, it's on page 124. We're going to do the 13th and 14th chapters called Malay Extra Letters and Chaser Missing Letters. What do we mean by this? Malay literally means full. A word is full, meaning that it's written. Hebrew words, certain Hebrew words can be written in different ways. Some with what's called full, meaning they have all of the letters that are possible for that word. And sometimes it's called chaser, which means it's missing some of the possible letters. Anytime this happens in the Torah, it immediately alerts us to the fact that different dimensions of meaning are being hinted to. Because if the word is full, it's a very, very different meaning than if the word is chaser, if it's missing letters. So we're going to start with extra letters. And the first one we're going to do, it's on page 125 for those who are following. And the verse is, Eila toldot shemayim va'aretz v'hi baram v'yom asat Hashem Elokim eretz v'shamayim. This is what's called the second telling of creation. After the Torah finishes the first 7 days, then it, in a sense, begins to tell part of the story, especially about Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are created on the 6th day. Well, we already had the 6th day in the first telling, but not with the details. The second telling fills in specifically what happened with Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So here it says, these are the generations. We're going to look at the word generations. These are the generations of heaven and earth on the day that Hashem Elokim, 2 names of God, created earth and heaven. So the word generations here can actually be written 3 different ways. It can be written with 1 vav, it can be written with 2 vavs, or it can be written with no vavs. And each one has significance. So in this verse, the word toldot, meaning these are the generations. Hi, Susan. Welcome. The word toldot is, okay, I'm going to go back. Someone's asking what the topic is of tonight. So we just said extra letters and missing letters, chapters 13 and 14 of 70 Faces. Okay, so the word toldot in the verse, these are the generations of heaven and earth. On the day that God made earth and heaven, so it's written with 2 vavs, which is, it's the full way of spelling this. Now, what's very interesting, the word toldot, generations, appears in the Torah and the Tanakh many times. Only twice is it written completely full with 2 vavs. And so if it's written twice, we want to see what's the connection between the 2 that are written full. So here we have, this is talking about the generations of heaven and earth when they were created. The only other time that the word toldot is written full comes in the book of Ruth. And that is when, excuse me, that's correct. At the very end of the book of Ruth, it gives over the genealogy of who came from Ruth and Boaz. And so, but it goes back goes back to Yehuda and Tamar. And so the genealogy is given over. And the last one is to David HaMelech, because the book of Ruth, it has meanings on many different levels, but one of them is to establish that King David came from Ruth. And that David is actually the last word of the book. But when it's talking about these generations, so it's written in full again. And these are starting from Yehud and Tamar, who gave birth to Peretz. So these are the only two times the genealogy leading to David HaMelech and the creation of heaven and earth. So what can we learn from this? So it's a very, very deep understanding, very fundamental understanding, is that in the second verse of the Torah, after we learn that God in the beginning created the heaven and earth, and then it says that the earth was chaotic and void, and darkness was on the face of the abyss. And then it says, V'ruach Elokim mirachefet al pnei hamayim. The Spirit of God moved across the waters. So this is an enigmatic statement. What does that mean? What is the Spirit of God? And what does it mean that it moved across the waters? So one of the Midrashim says a very, very important thing. It says the Spirit of God was the Spirit of Mashiach. So what can we learn from this? What were the sages trying to tell us? And it's such an important point, because in the world, from the time of Darwin and evolution, which is somewhat paradoxical because Darwin was a very religious Christian. He wasn't an atheist. He didn't see his theory of evolution in any way compromising his belief in God. But the theory of evolution and what has been done with it, and especially philosophically, is also the idea that there is no intrinsic master plan in the development of the universe. It's the survival of the fittest, and that's just the way it happened. But there's no inherent rhyme or reason. Now, of course, Judaism does not believe this. We believe that there is a creator, and there is divine providence, and there is a master plan. So what can we learn right in the beginning? That the Spirit of God moved across the waters, meaning the Spirit of Mashiach, is that from the beginning of creation, there's we'll call it an end game. There's a purpose. There's a direction in which the world is moving towards redemption. And so therefore, in this word toldot being written full in the creation of the world, and also in the lineage leading to the creation of David, from who comes the Mashiach. So we see that there is a godly influence, there is a master plan. How it plays itself out, so of course only God knows exactly how, but we have a firm tradition that the world is moving towards goodness. With all of the evil and negativity throughout history, still that we believe that the world is getting better all the time. This is something that Reb Shlomo Carlebach used to say all the time. He would say, it might look like the world is really messed up, and It's not going in a good direction. But he said, really, it's getting better all the time. It's moving towards redemption and the Messianic era. So that's our first insight with what's called the full spelling of the word toldot. In places where it's not written full, it hints to that there's something missing here. There's some tikkun that has to be made. We don't have time to go through every toldot in the Torah, but that's the basic idea. When it's not written full, there's a reason for it. And in the context of when that word will appear, we could sometimes see very obviously what is being talked about and what is missing. Okay, so the next one is on the bottom of page 125. It's a short Torah, but it's so important. So when it's talking about the creation of man, actually on the sixth day, it says that God formed man. And the word for formed has an extra yud. Usually it would be written Yetzer, Yud, Sadi, Resh. But here it's written with two yuds, which is very unusual. So immediately the sages were, well, if there's an extra letter yud here, what is it telling us? And so since the context is that the formation of man, so they learned from this that this is what's called, from the same word as Yetzer, which means to form, what's called the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination, and Yetzer Hara, and the evil inclination. So I just see that Rabbi just put the verse. If anyone wants to look in the chat, can actually see the extra yud here. But Yetzer, and those who have the book, it's on page 125. So this is, I gave it over very short in the book, but it has so many ramifications. This idea that every person is born with. In other words, God purposely formed man with the ability to choose, because if there's no Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Ra, there's only Yetzer HaTov, then there's no choice. Because by nature, everyone would be good, everyone would make the right decisions, and would make the right choices. And so this idea that implanted within the psyche of every person is both the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Ra. What it means practically is it's 24/7, we'll call it a battle, a challenge for the Yetzer HaTov to rule over what's called the Yetzer Hara. And I think, if we're honest, we all know very, very, very well that we have both of these tendencies. We have these inclinations. And life is all about balancing these two inclinations and turning the energy of the Yetzer Hara to the good. In other words, on one level of reality, Tov and Ra are complete opposites. And the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is constantly trying to challenge us, trip us up, fool us, and rule over us. And so to become an image of God, it means that we have to kind of fight and battle against these tendencies and to overcome them. And when we overcome them, then we truly have earned our being in the image of God. This is such a basic part of Jewish philosophy of the role of the evil inclination. But on a deep level, so this is taught in Chabad very, very much, that there's two levels. There's one level of ruling of the good inclination ruling over the evil inclination. And then there's the level, in a sense, a higher level of turning the evil inclination towards the good. In other words, taking our passions, taking our desires, and channeling them towards the good. And that's in a sense a deeper level. It's a very, very high level to defeat the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. But it's even a higher level to be able to take the energy and to transform it into the good. So that was our second example of an extra letter and what we can learn from it. The next one is an amazing insight that both Rashi and the Balaturim point out, and that is on page 126. So it says in the book of Vayikra, "And I will remember my covenant with Yaakov." And this is part of a teaching in the Torah about what is the consequences of not listening to Hashem, and let's say the reward for listening to Hashem. So here, so it says, so as at the end, if we listen to Hashem, then God will make a covenant with Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And here, Yaakov is written with an extra vav. Usually the word Yaakov is Yud, Ayin, Kuf, Bet, 4 letters. And here it's written with an extra vav. And Rashi points out an amazing thing. And at first glance, it's like, what's the connection? Because we're talking about around 700-800 years difference here. And that is, Rashi says 5 times in the Tanakh, not just in the 5 books of Moses, but in the whole Tanakh, the name Yaakov is written 5 times with an extra vav. It's written hundreds of times without a vav, but 5 times it's written with a vav. And Rashi points out, interestingly enough, Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu, 5 times his name is written without a vav, and it's pronounced Elia instead of Eliyahu. If you take away the vav, it becomes Elia. And so 5 times in the book of Kings, the name Eliyahu is spelled without a vav. So here we have, tonight we're doing extra letters and missing letters. So here's one that has both to it, just like the word toldot, generations. So what's the connection here? So the Balaturim explains that, in a sense, Yaakov took the vavs of Eliyahu's name as an assurity that at the right time in history, Eliyahu, who according to tradition will precede the Mashiach, that Yaakov is holding on to the 5 vavs in Eliyahu's name, because in a sense his name isn't complete because he hasn't fulfilled his full tafkid in the world. And the culmination of the tafkid of Eliyahu is to announce the coming of Mashiach, to precede the coming of Mashiach, and along with that, actually to bring prophecy back to Israel. So the Balaturim and Rashi say that, as it were, Yaakov is holding these 5 vavs in a surety, as a what's called a picadon. How do you say picadon in English? What is it? Deposit. That's my wife. Thank you very much, Rachel. A deposit. Yaakov is holding as a deposit these vavs. Now, the Baal HaTurim then points out another very amazing thing. In the book of Bamidbar, and I can't remember, I think it was even last Tuesday for those who come to the Tuesday class, or collateral. Thank you, it's collateral. So we learn about the story of Pinchas. Pinchas, there was, when Bilam, the heathen prophet, could not succeed in cursing the Jews. So his idea was, we'll get the Jews to sin and they will bring a curse down on themselves. So a whole, basically orgy was designed to entrap and seduce the men of Israel. And it was starting to succeed. This is at the end of Parshat Balak in Bamidbar. And one of the princes of the tribe of Shimon, Zimri, takes the princess of Moab, Cosby, and is having relations with her very publicly. And so Pinchas, and a plague had broken out, and it was consuming the camp. Thousands of people were dying. And Pinchas, he killed them. And he put an end to the desecration of God's name. And the plague stopped. So in a sense, he saved all of Israel. In the next parsha, God grants him a covenant of peace. In the word peace, the letter Vav is broken in the middle. It's called a Vav Katia. It's not a complete Vav. There's a space in the middle. And much is said about this. But in short, and this is what we learned, I don't want to go too deep into it, but we have a paradox here. How could God grant a covenant of peace to someone who killed 2 people? But on the other hand, he saved maybe millions of people, because the implication is that the plague would have wiped out Am Yisrael. So he gets his covenant of peace, but the Vav in the word peace is broken, to say that ideally we should be able to make peace through peace and not by having to defeat our enemies. But unfortunately, many times the only way to make peace with an aggressor is to defeat them, and then you can make peace. So we see it in Israel all the time. The first 2 peace treaties that we made with Arab countries was Egypt and Jordan, who, after a number of attempts to destroy Israel, and when they saw that they could not succeed, then they made peace. So, and right now, with the Abraham Accords, in the bigger picture, much of the Arab world is starting to see that they are not going to be able to defeat Israel. And that opens the gate of peace. So here we have a broken Vav. So the Baal HaTurim brings in that until Eliyahu a Navi comes, until Elijah prophet comes, and he brings along with him the Mashiach and the full redemption, well, there won't be peace in the world. And this Vav will be broken. And the missing Vavs in Pinchas, in Eliyahu's name, in a sense, will be missing and is being held as collateral by Yaakov until that happens. So this is just an amazing idea. And the Baal HaTurim adds the tradition, Pinchas ze Eliyahu. Pinchas is Eliyahu. In other words, the soul of Eliyahu is a reincarnation of the soul of Pinchas. And so Pinchas, he also has a broken vav that needs to be fixed, that needs to be complete. So this is just an amazing conception here. So the Baal HaTurim points out one other thing, that the word shalom with the full vav is the gematria of Zeh Mashiach. In other words, until Mashiach comes, there really won't be complete peace in the world. And we obviously see it. There's wars all over the place. So Zeh Mashiach, that is the complete peace. And that's when the Vav will become complete. That's when the Vav, in a sense, will be returned to Eliyahu's name these 5 times. And we should merit to see it. Okay, so one more example of what's called malay, having a word being spelled in full with an extra letter, is the name David. Now, usually, in almost every place, we spell David, Daled, Vav, Daled, all over the place. But there's a few times that it's spelled Daled, Vav, Yud, Daled, with an extra Yud. So what does this mean? So to understand it, we have to understand how David came to be anointed as the king. So after Shaul, King Saul, disobeyed God's orders, and God sent the prophet Samuel, to tell Shaul, I'm taking the kingdom away from you. I'm taking the kingship away from you. And in secret, because Shaul, of course, became very, very defensive, and it led to many, many unsettling stories in his life. But God sends Shmuel to the family of Yishai, and he says, one of the sons of Yishai, he will be the king. So Shmuel goes, and he goes to the house of Yishai, and he had many sons. And he saw the first one, who was strong and handsome and had charisma. And Shmuel was like, this must be the one. And God said, no, you're just looking on the outside. You're not looking at the inside of this person. Not that he was bad, but this is not the one that I'm talking about. So Shmuel actually went to all of the sons of David. Each one was, like, in his eyes, was worthy to be a king, and probably was, but it's just not the one that God wanted. And so when he went through all of his sons, Shmuel says to Yishai, these are all of your sons? Because God sent me to anoint one of your sons, and he's telling me none of these are the right one. So it's a whole long story, but David, he is out in the field with the sheep, and he's a bit of an outcast. And so Shmuel says, well, send for him. And when he comes, so God says to him, Zehu, this is he, this is the one, Zehu. So if you add a yud to David, with the way we usually spell it is the numerical value of 14. If you add this yud, it equals 24. And the Baal HaTurim points out that 24 equals this phrase, Zehu. This is the one. And we're taught that the difference between Moshe's prophecy and all the other prophets prophesied with the phrase, Ko Amar Hashem, thus says God. Now the letter Chaf also means ke, like, similar to, approximately. So the prophets, they had prophecy, but it was somewhat translucent. It was not 100% clear. And so they said, Ko Amar Hashem. Only Moshe Rabbeinu prophesied with Zeh Hadavar Asher Tziva Hashem. This is the exact thing that God has commanded. Because Moshe was on a level that none of the other prophets were on that level. That he saw God face to face, panim el panim. God spoke to him mouth to mouth. So here we have God saying, Zehu, this is the one. Meaning, exactly, this is the one. So that gematria equals David with the Yud. Now there's one more, a bit more Kabbalistic explanation, is that in the 7 shepherds, or what we call the Ushpizim, the 7 special guests that we invite on Sukkot. So each one of the Ushpizim is corresponds to one of the Sfirot. And David corresponds to Malchut, which is kingship. And so along with this, there is a Kabbalistic tradition that each of the Sfirot has a particular name of God associated with it. So the name associated with the sphere of Malchut is the name Adni or Adonai. This is the name of Malchut, of kingship. And because we don't pronounce, as we're going to see very soon in the missing letters, we don't pronounce the name, the 4-letter name of God, Yud Kei Vav Kei. As it's written, we say the name Adni, Aleph and Dalet and Nun and Yud. So this is connected to Malchut. Now, what's his connection to David? And David with the Yud equaling 24. So we're told that in permuting letters, if you have 4 letters, you can permute them in 24 different ways. 4 letters permute into 24 different permutations. And so the 4-letter name, Aleph and Dalet and Nun and Yud, can be permuted in 24 ways. In other words, that's the fullness of that name in Malchut, in the aspect of kingship, which is the aspect of David. So by adding a Yud to his name means that he's very connected to this aspect of Malchut. And we see that because all future kings of Israel, legitimate kings, come from David until Mashiach. So that's a more Kabbalistic explanation of the extra letter Yud that appears sometimes in David's name. Okay, now we're going to go to the next chapter, chapter 14. And with this, we're going to finish the first section of the book. which is an amazing thing. We'll have gone through 14 chapters. So the first one that we're going to do is on page 130. And this is when Abraham buys the cave of Machpelah to bury Sarah. And it says that he asks the people of Hebron if they would go to Ephron, and that Avram would like to buy the cave in the field around Machpelah. And so the people go to Ephron, and Ephron at first comes and says, of course I will sell it. I will, he implies I will give it to you. And Avram insists to pay for it. So a verse comes, it's in Bereshit, in Genesis 23, verse 16. And it says like this, and Avram listened to Ephron, and Avram weighed out to Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the sons of Het, 400 shekels of silver accepted by the merchant. In other words, Avram paid 400 shekels because that's what Ephron said the selling price was. But in this one sentence, the name Ephron appears twice. The first time it's written with a vav, Ephron with a vav, and the second time it's written without a vav. When it's written without a vav, it actually equals 400, exactly the amount that he asked for. So Rashi makes a comment that because Ephron implied that he would be happy just to give it to him. And so Avram, no, I don't want to take gifts, I'll pay for it. We're told that 400 pieces of silver was an astronomical amount for what he was selling to Avram. So Rashi comments on this idea of this missing vav the second time, is that Ephron talked a lot, but he did a little. In other words, he talked as if he was going to help Avram out here. He was going to do him a favor. And in the end, he asked him for an astronomical amount of money. And so this is all alluded to in the two spellings of Ephron in the same verse. The same verse. Again, the first time it's written what we'll call malay, full. And the second one, it's written chaser, missing the letter vav. Since we're talking about this, I just want to point out very quickly, all the numbers in the Torah are highly symbolic. So if the Torah mentions this amount of 400, so what we would do is like, well, where else does this number appear? Because if it appears in other places, most likely there's a deep connection. So I'm going to do this very, very, very quickly. It could be expanded greatly. But when Avram buys this plot of land, this is the first acquisition of the land of Israel. And so we're told it represents, God had promised Avram he would inherit the whole land. But up to that point, Avram technically didn't own any of the land. So it's highly symbolic and important, his purchase of this plot of land in the land of Israel, because it symbolizes, in a sense, Avram beginning to take possession of the whole land. And so later, the sages, when they're discussing what is the size of Eretz Yisrael, so they said it's 400 parsang by 400 parsang. A parsang is a measure. It's more than a mile. And they were giving the big borders of Eretz Yisrael, the borders that God promised to Avram. So it's 400 by 400. So how did they come up with that number? They didn't like exactly measure, because it became symbolic that Avram buys the land for 400. And so the measurement of the land is 400 by 400. And then we'll add another piece to this. When Yaakov leaves Eretz Yisrael, and he goes and he marries Rachel and Leah, and now he's coming back after 20 years. And remember, Esav comes, and Yaakov is very afraid that, because the last time he saw Esav wanted to kill him for taking the blessing, or what he perceived was taking the blessing. And so the Torah says that Esav is coming with 400 men. So symbolically, who are these 400 men? It represents, this is like the force that's trying to keep Yaakov of coming back into the land, which is 400 by 400. So these 400 men that are coming with Esav represent this counter force to try to keep Yaakov out of the land. So again, the number 400. And then we see it one more time when David, because we just mentioned David, after he is anointed the king to come, David would take no action against Shaul. He loved Shaul. It was his father-in-law. And even though Shaul was trying to kill him, David had the opportunity a number of times to kill Shaul in self-defense. He wouldn't lift a finger against him. So he was like king in waiting. He would not, he was very humble, and he was not going to like force the issue. And so it says that David had to escape from Shaul many times. And many people began to be drawn to David. And so one place in the book of Shmuel, it mentions how many people came to be with David? 400. And so we're told, because when Esav and Yaakov finally meet, there's no mention of the 400 men that came with him. The Torah is silent. What happened to these 400 men? So spiritually, these 400 men that tried to keep Yaakov out of the land, they, in a sense, come back, and they're the core group that is with David, who conquers more of the land of Israel than anyone had ever conquered to this day. And again, it was with these original 400 men. So this is all just addition to this idea of why Ephron is written once with a vav and once without a vav. Now, the next one is maybe one of the most important ones about missing letters. And that is that at the burning bush, so when Moshe says to God, who will I tell sent me? And so first God says, tell them that Ekia asher Ekia, I will be that which I will be, sent you. And then he says, tell them Ekia sent you. And then it says, this is my name forever. Now it's talking about the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, not the name Ekia. About the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, it says, this is my name forever. This is my remembrance from generation to generation. So there, the sages point out that the word, this is my name forever. Forever is le'olam, forever. But in the Torah, it's written without a vav, which means that without a vav, the same root that means forever also means world, olam, le'olam, but it also means to hide. I give helam, lehelem, to hide something. So the sages, it was an oral tradition, but this is where they learn it from. But it was an oral tradition that we do not pronounce the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei as it's written, except in the temple. And only of rare occasions was the name pronounced the way it is written. We basically no longer have that tradition. And that's why every time in the Torah and in prayer where the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei appears, we pronounce it with the same name that we talked about before, the name of Malchut, the name of kingship, and Aleph and Dalet and Nun and Yud. Excuse me. Because the sages learned the other way you can read it, other than this is my name forever, is this is my name to hide. In other words, this is my name, but it needs to be hidden. So in the 100 blessings that we say every day, Baruch Atah Hashem, we use the name Adni, Adonai, instead of the way it's written, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. So maybe of all the examples that we could bring of what we learn from a missing letter, this is maybe the most important, because it affects every time we mention God's name. In the Torah, in blessings, in prayer, we hide based on this missing vav. So this is a very fundamental idea here. Okay, so there are many, many more here, but we'll just pick one more. And this is a very, very important statement. It's on page 132, the middle Torah there, that 2 different times when the people in the desert are giving Moshe and Aaron a very, very hard time. And Moshe says to the people, V'nachnu ma, what are we that you're complaining against us? We're just translating, giving over God's commandments. We're giving over God's will. So you're coming to complain against us. Well, you're really complaining against God, because we're just a spokesman here. We're just the ones that are giving over God's words. So they say, V'nachnu ma. And this is held out as an expression of Moshe's tremendous humbleness. And Aaron's also, because what are we? He's talking about him and Aaron. But of course, Moshe, the Torah testifies that he was the most humble person in the world. But the question is, why doesn't it say V'anachnu ma? Because usually, if we're going to say we, it's anachnu. So this phrase, V'nachnu ma, is missing an aleph. So this already kind of tells us what the deeper meaning here is. By missing an aleph, it's part of the expression of Moshe's humbleness. But a little bit deeper, the letter aleph is the first letter of ani, which means I, ego, the self. So Moshe is saying, what are we? We are nothing, because if you take the letters ani and you just permute them differently, it's ayin, nothing. V'nachnu ma, what are we? But he's basically saying we're nothing. We're nothing. You're like, if you want to complain, I mean, you shouldn't complain to God, but by complaining about us, we're nothing here. We're just God's spokesman. So that's the missing aleph there. I think that's a good place to stop. That this is two great examples, because throughout the Torah, throughout the Tanakh, there are many, many, many words that are written with extra letters or missing letters. And every single one of them, there's a reason for it. And the sages knew this. And many times they had oral traditions already, but here they would be able to see it, because if it's the letters missing in the Torah, you can see it. And then they would put like one and one together, and they would see how the oral tradition goes with the actual written Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah. So if in the written Torah there's an extra letter or a missing letter, immediately we have to say, well, why is that? What is it teaching us? What is the deeper meaning? So I'll just give us all a blessing that we can continue to delve deeper and deeper into our holy Torah, and all of the secrets should be revealed to us.